Whatever violent acts are committed by inhabitants of Gaza or the West Bank, the one killer argument that all Israel critics will resort to at some point is, but Israel is occupying them, so of course there is resistance. There are several things wrong with this argument, but the core question is Israel indeed occupying Gaza and the West Bank? There is a lot of information on this online, but my impression is that the majority of people do not make the effort to study, apply themselves, and cut through the complexity of the situation. As a result, most people I've seen resort to mainstream opinions that are not well substantiated. For example, you might have seen that map which shows Palestine is shrinking more and more due to Israeli encroaching on Palestinian territory, and that is used uncritically as an argument for Israel's alleged imperialism. As a spoiler, the land called Palestine on that map was a Jewish state, not an Arab state of Palestine as it is used today. It's just the same name. So, today I want to walk you through the actual facts behind the territorial history of Israel and the so-called Palestine, and put them into the right perspective, because apparently it is necessary to do some myth-busting here, despite all the information available. Please stay with me. No matter how far back you go in history, you will see that the land of Palestine never existed. Just go and check it out on Wikipedia, it's not a secret. To the contrary, the region which we now associate with Palestine has belonged to multiple countries and empires over the centuries, but has never been an autonomous country in that sense. Historically, if there is a people who can make a rightful claim on the territory of Israel, it's the Jews. In line with this, in fact, even the Quran itself literally says that ancient Judea, which is roughly the same area as Israel today, don't pin me down on the details, belongs to the Jews. The first time Palestine appears as a country is when the British chose it as a name for the region which they won over from the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. They call their piece of the Ottoman Empire British Mandate for Palestine, inspired by a name given to that region during the Roman Empire. They then split this into two states, Palestine and Transjordan. Palestine was meant for the Jews and Transjordan for the Arabs. Note, Palestine was created as a Jewish state. Of course, there were people living in both newly created states, but they did not identify as residents of Palestine, just Arabs, Jews, Christians, or other minority groups. And how could they, since the state of Palestine had just been invented by the British? There are about 700,000 people living in the to-be Jewish state of Palestine back then, most of them Arabs, but there are also Jews and other religions. When the British plan for a Jewish Palestine becomes known to the Arabs living in the region, they don't like it and start to rebel against it, even though the much bigger country Transjordan was already available to Arabs. They also wanted Jewish Palestine to be Arabic. So the British withdraw from Palestine and leave it to the United Nations, who's just been created, to come up with a new plan. In 1948, the UN comes up with a plan which separates Palestine further, which, I repeat, was designed to be given fully to the Jews, into an Arab majority and Jewish majority country. Settling Jews within an Arab-dominated country is not an option, because history has shown that Jews, wherever they go, have been the victims of genocides and persecutions. The Jews accept that deal, even though it's not what was initially agreed with the British. Egypt and Jordan still do not, because they don't want any state of Israel, no matter how small. The deal is still implemented, based on the assumption that the UN would oversee its implementation. And so the Jewish part of UN-separated Palestine goes to the Jewish Zionist Organization, which then becomes the first Jewish government, and the Arab part of Palestine goes to Egypt and Jordan as temporary caretakers so they can figure out how to design the new Arab-only part of Palestine. So what happens is that, the state of Israel is founded on the basis of the compromise border suggested by the UN. Egypt and Jordan do not attempt to found a new state in the Arab part of the UN-separated Palestine. Instead, they revolt against the UN plan. They don't want any state of Israel at all, and do not want to support it by agreeing to the UN separation proposal. So the two new states are not in sync. While Jews start settling in the Jewish part of Palestine and call it Israel, the Arab part of Palestine remains a non-state and occupied by Egypt and Jordan, who refuse to found a new state of Palestinian Arabs on the territory. Instead, the moment Israel is created, they start attacking it again and again. The UN does not follow and enforce the implementation of its own plan and does not come to the defense of Israel. Meanwhile, civilians in both territories leave or are expelled. Jews leave Arab Palestine and surrounding Arab countries and move into Israel, and most Arabs in the new Israel leave it too and go to the new UN-declared Arab Palestine or other Arab countries. Note that Jews at this time are forced into fleeing violently, not just from surrounding Arab states, but also other Muslim countries at that time, while Arabs leaving from Israel are either expelled or leave voluntarily, as today Israel generally accepts Arab residents. About 20 years pass by. Egypt and Jordan still have not made an attempt to create an Arab state of Palestine. Gaza is occupied by Egypt, and the West Bank has been annexed by Jordan and called West Jordan. Just let that sink in for a moment. Again, Arab states had a chance to found an Arab Palestine, but chose not to do so. In 1967, Egypt attacks Israel once again. The conflict escalates, and Jordan and Syria join in against Israel. Israel wins quickly. That's why it's called the Six-Day War. And when it wins, it decides to take over occupation of the still unclaimed territories of Gaza and the West Bank from Egypt and Jordan. Important detail, it does not annex them, it occupies them, unlike Jordan, who had just annexed the West Bank. So as before, Israel does not occupy Palestine. But suddenly, that new occupation by Israel becomes a big problem for Muslim countries and their classic allies in international leftist communities, and is accused of breaking the UN border agreement and international law through an illegal annexation of territory. Which I find interesting, to put it mildly, because first of all, Egypt and Jordan, as mentioned, had not even agreed to the UN plan. So there was no agreement to be broken, and these areas still were not sovereign Palestinian states. And secondly, Israel never annexed Gaza or the West Bank, unlike Jordan, which again just annexed the West Bank instead of supporting an independent Palestinian state. So what really happened is that Israel occupied two areas with no sovereignty that were previously already occupied by Egypt and Jordan. In other words, what changes is the occupier, not the fact that they were occupied. And nothing changes for the residents of Gaza and the West Bank except for the religion of the occupier and the fact that the occupier is now democratic. And so now something interesting happens. After hundreds of years of occupation by the Ottoman Empire, occupation by the British, and occupation by the Egyptian and Jordans, the liberation from occupation of the same unclaimed territory by the democratic state of Israel is suddenly a top priority for everyone. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, is created to fight the occupation by Israel, financed by a big alliance of non-democratic Arab states, the Soviet Union, Latin America, and Africa, among them Egypt and Jordan, of course. So, see what is happening here. Egypt and Jordan, along with many other states, have denied Palestinian identity and sovereignty for dozens of years, and all they cared about is to destroy Israel. They fail. And now they suddenly discover a Palestinian identity and finance their fight against Israel from within Israel. This is when the concept of an occupied Palestine is invented, propagated heavily and supported by anti-capitalists all over the world, with a traditional support of tribalism and opposition of imperialism. Note also the use of language here. The continued name Palestine seems to imply a link to British Palestine, even though that was designed to be given to Jews. This was the start, in my opinion, of what we now know as the Israel-Palestine conflict. Constant attacks from Gaza and the West Bank onto mainland Israel, constant defense by Israel, an intensive propaganda by all Muslim states and their allies, including via the majority seats in the UN General Assembly, spreading the story that Israel is an oppressive, aggressive imperialist. Just hold on here for a second and consider the irony of this narrative, considering that Israel is the actual underdog here in terms of territory, persecution, and global support, and just by sheer size of the country. A couple of decades pass where Israel remains undefeated and keeps fighting back attacks, not just from Gaza and the West Bank, but also other Muslim countries such as Lebanon and Yemen. So in the 90s, the Palestine campaign, which I call it now, changes direction and begins supporting a two-state solution. Ever since then, the conflict has basically been about how to implement it. We know today that this still hasn't worked out, and with the background I've just given you, it will not come as a surprise that I think the main reason for this is constant sabotaging by the Palestinian campaign. First, no unified Palestinian leadership who a Palestinian state could even be handed over to. Second, constant breaches of peace agreements. And third, the unrealistic demand to resettle all 700,000 refugees and their descendants who left Israel after its foundation in Israel, which would risk the Jewish majority in the state, which was the main reason to found Israel in the first place. Needless to say, the Palestinian campaign blames Israel for the failing of the two-state solution. Despite these issues, as a first step towards a two-state solution in 2005, Israel agreed to withdraw from Gaza so they can elect their own government. What happens? The jihadist Islamic terrorist organization Hamas is elected. Hamas has a clear agenda documented in its founding charter to eradicate Israel and kill all Jews. And the majority of Gazans support this agenda. They voted Hamas. Every year, Gaza fires about 1,000 missiles onto Israel. How do you negotiate a two-state solution with such a people? And how can you protect yourself from this evil neighbor? So Israel builds a wall at the border and allows trespassing of the borders only by application in order to control terrorist movements. As usual, these measures are interpreted as an ongoing occupation and oppression and used as a reason for everything that is wrong with Gaza, most notably its bad economic situation. My question here is, if you have a people that elected a genocidal organization as their leaders and wanted to kill you, how relaxed would you be about allowing them to come into your country, develop any industries which could support further violence? And if you faced hundreds of attacks every year, wouldn't you have to find a practical solution, such as building a wall? In other words, what would you do differently? So, do you think it is reasonable to ask Israel to drop all security measures before Gazans have proven to be peaceful and accept Israel's right to exist? So let's turn to the West Bank now. Israel has not annexed the West Bank, but is occupying it in the sense that it shares military and administrative control with the Palestinian Authority, the Arab governing body of the West Bank, the equivalent of Hamas, if you will, in the West Bank. The area is divided into areas A, B, and C. Basically, the Palestinian Authority controls Area A, Israel and the Palestinian Authority share Area B, and Israel controls Area C, which is at the border to Israel. Unlike Gaza, the West Bank is not just partly occupied by Israel, but there are also 144 Israeli settlements with 450,000 Israeli settlers there, supported by the current Israeli government. Most lawyers and courts agree that this is against international law, and is a sign that Israel does not seem to support a two-state solution, where all areas of the West Bank become part of a Palestinian state. It rather looks like it either does not agree to hand over the West Bank at all, or at least not Area A. Unhelpfully, this becomes an added reason why the two-state solution does not seem to be in reach. On the other hand, if Palestinian leaders have proven over decades their unwillingness to enter real peace and negotiate a realistic two-state solution, does it not make sense that Israel does not trust the peace process in the West Bank and tries to prevent the development of another Gaza by leveraging settlers as a local presence there? Especially if it does so in its own Area C and in a largely peaceful manner. I believe that even if the settlements in the West Bank were a blocker to the two-state solution, mentioning it as the top reason for failed peace negotiations, while blockers on the Palestinian side are much larger and more violent, seems inappropriate to me. So, what should we make of this? What do I make of this? My perspective is Gaza occupied? No. Israel is trying all it can to protect itself from a population with predominantly genocidal tendencies. Is the West Bank occupied? It is militarily co-managed but not occupied, because no entity exists that could even be occupied. Neither Egypt nor Jordan in the early days, nor later Palestinian organizations have managed to provide a viable concept for sovereignty. Should Israel wait forever with any settlements until this will happen? Maybe. Does Israel's interference in Gaza and of the West Bank have anything to do with each other? Against the prevailing narrative, I don't think so. As a reminder, there is no joint Palestinian leadership. In fact, both governments even fight each other. So I don't see how both areas can be handled in the same way. And this is important to keep in mind. For example, when people refer to any developments in the West Bank as an explanation of Hamas actions. And the narrative of the Israeli occupation becomes even more doubtful when you zoom out a bit and put this entire situation into a wider perspective. I'm wondering, first, there are less than 1% Jews in the world. There is no other country in the world which is predominantly Jewish. Living as a minority in other countries, as is practiced by other minority religions or cultures, has resulted in genocide and persecutions in most countries again and again. So, would it be a sustainably safe option for Jews to go back to the diaspora? Second, the area of the Arab countries is 600 times as big as Israel, but their population is only 50 times as much as Israel's. Is this piece of land really needed by Arabs? Third, why is it that when it comes to Israel, Arabs living in Gaza and the West Bank self-identify as the independent people of Palestinians that is so distinct from other Arab countries not to want to resettle there? But when it's about fighting Israel, there's suddenly a strong Arab coalition globally. Fourth, why is it that the history of Arab states, which is the result of aggressive Muslim imperialism, is not considered at all, while the single tiny country of Israel is considered imperialistic? Fifth, why is it that the people who are criticizing the fact that about 700,000 Arabs living in Palestine were partly forced to leave when the State of Israel was created don't also mention the more than 850,000 Jews who were forced to leave the surrounding Arab countries and many more from other Muslim states at the same time? When you zoom out like this and put things into perspective, can you really still claim that Israel is an imperialist in any sense of the word? Or are we rather dealing with a propaganda campaign to close an uncomfortable hole in the Muslim empire? So, when you willingly condemn Israel as an imperialist oppressor, think about which agenda you are actually supporting.